This is the third video on the topic of adolescence. In this one, we'll be talking about identity formation, some personality developments, and then potentially relationships with peers and parents. You may remember back in chapter one, well, and throughout the semester, we've talked about Erickson's model of identity formation. And you may recall that Erickson had this notion that you went through these various stages of the life course and you would have crises and there was some virtue, right, that you were supposed to come out of. Well, adolescence is associated with two crises or two aspects of identity formation. One of them is what's referred to as identity versus identity confusion. And then the other one is, and it's sort of towards the end of adolescence because we'll pick up on it some more when we get to young adulthood, and it's intimacy versus isolation. But let's go back to identity versus identity confusion. According to Erickson's theory, that what happens during this time of adolescence is there are four different, if you will, identity statuses, and you can refer to your chapter outline to help you sort of follow along. But again, remember the idea of adolescence is this period of exploration and trying new things. And so these identity statuses are, you have the first one, which is identity achievement, which is the notion that you have tried out different aspects of the self. You've tried out different ways of being, you've explored different options, and you've settled on who you are. So you've explored and you have achieved your sense of self, your identity. Second one is what's referred to as foreclosure. Identity foreclosure implies that you really haven't explored anything. You just accepted what others have told you you're supposed to do, and you have just foreclosed, right? You're going with what your parents have said you are. You haven't challenged any, or you haven't considered, your parents have said that you are I don't know, a liberal Democrat, and so you're a liberal Democrat without ever really having explored, well, maybe you're not. Maybe you are more conservative, or maybe you are more Christian or something. So foreclosure, you just accept. Moratorium is this period where you haven't settled on an identity, rather you're just kind of jumping around. You're doing a lot of the research. So moratorium sort of implies that you're at a that there is, so right now we're on a foreclosure moratorium. You can't have any foreclosure. So a moratorium on identity formation is, there is no identity formation. I'm just confused. I'm trying all these different things and I don't know, right? And the fourth one is what's referred to as identity diffusion. And that's sort of like you're doing nothing. You're not exploring, you haven't settled. It's just, you're just nothing. And generally the sense is that the goal is identity formation, the identity achievement, and the way you get to that achievement, and the people that have the greatest sense of well-being and self-satisfaction are those that have tried out different things and they have come to this decision. I think about the Amish, who I talk an awful lot about, the Springer, that running around in late adolescence, that is sort of like they go try different things, and the majority of them come back to their community and they settle on that identity. And having an opportunity to explore, we often we do better with the things that we choose, as we talk. Well, oh wait, that was my psychology. Okay, the other one then is this idea of intimacy versus isolation. And so during this period of our life, and we'll continue into the next stage where we form family formation, are we going to turn towards others and establish intimate family romantic relationships, or are we going to be are we going to live isolated solitary lives? And those are two, that's another aspect that comes through this stage of life. Your book also talks about spiritual identity formation and racial and ethnic identity formation. So again, these are things that you may experience during adolescence. I certainly know in my experience during my adolescence, I was going to my best friend's church, which was very, very different than the ones that my parents went to. And eventually I settled on my sense of who I am. But this is part of your identity development. Are you going to identify as a Christian or a Muslim or an agnostic? Maybe there'll be a period where you identify as a Buddhist, and then but this is all normal. This is all healthy going through this period. And then for people of color or immigrants, they also go through a period of racial and ethnic identity formation. People who have white privilege, like myself, we don't have this part of our identity because our identity is the sort of the norm. But certainly for immigrants who have to decide, are they going to embrace their new homeland, or are they going to hold on to to their ethnic and racial identity? And this can be a very difficult transition that white folk like myself, I can't relate to what that must be like. The pressure of from my parents or my grandparents to speak my native language, but yet when I'm with my peer group, I'm made fun of for that. So, but this is part of that struggle, and it does depend in part on if your immigration was forced or if it was chosen. If you were forced to immigrate because you were running from violence, you might still be grieving the loss of your identity. On the other hand, if I have voluntarily want to get away from my identity or my previous ethnic identity, I could embrace my new homeland and my new culture with open arms. So those are variables too. Also during this period, if you'll move down to the next box, our relationships begin to change. In the video that I've made reference to, that I've loaded up in our chapter resources, there's that she talks about. One of the things that's important is, well, one of the things that happens during adolescence is we turn away from our parents. It's not that we turn our backs on our parents or we don't need our parents, but part of this development, this identity development, is we rearrange, if you will, the roles of other people. Our peers do become more important than they were. They're not replacing our parents. Our family of origin is still critical to our well-being, but there are changes. And so this goes along with parenting styles, right? And the conflict that our culture tells us is the stereotypical conflict that's supposed to happen between between teenager and parent is not universal, nor does it have to happen. This is not an inevitable thing that teenagers and parents are going to have conflicts with each other, that kids are going to think that their parents are dumb. This is a social construct, right? This doesn't have to happen. It is, I like to think of it like this. It has to happen that parents lose some of their social rank with their children, or their children would never leave home. Imagine if you adored your parents the same at 17, the same way you did when you were 7 or when you were 4, you would never leave home. And imagine if your parents adored you the same way at 17 as they did when you were 4. They would never want you to leave home, right? You would never launch. You would never become a full adult with your own family. So this change has to happen. And when parents they talk about, authoritarian styles and authoritative styles, but when parents provide a warm, loving, nurturing space and a safety net, but yet also acknowledge that part of human development is for their children to want to leave, to put space, to turn away, to question, right? Because remember, the brain has developed now so that an adolescent's brain can cognitively begin to question what the parents say. This is all the way it's supposed to work. So a teenager, 14, 15, 16-year-old begins to question their parents. And when parents become defensive, that can create conflict. If, on the other hand, a parent says, they're learning, this is how they're going to learn, and we need to give them the safe space to make mistakes, but also when they come back, because when a family, when parents can provide that safe place for them to come and process their learning, children will return, and when they're allowed to learn, wow, maybe my parents were right? They will come back. And anyway, so that's sort of what this last box is. The point is that conflict between parents and children is not inevitable, nor is it universal. It's a cultural phenomena. We don't have to have the parent teenager conflict that gets ugly, right? But this is part of the natural process, the normal developmental process for children to begin to question their parents and for them to want to move further away. And how the parents respond and how the children understand what's happening will influence, right? Because it's what your textbook calls individualization. It's the struggle for autonomy, right? It's the same thing that happened when kids were 2. When they were 2 and they were learning that they could make things happen, the teenager is doing that too. And now they're taking risks and they're learning, and things are happening they're happening very quickly. But we will have one more that's going to wrap up this chapter.